Every so often, a game comes along that breaks all assumptions about what the hardware it runs on is capable of. The BBC Micro Model B, the Beeb to its friends, isn't usually considered one of the popular gaming platforms of the 1980s, probably because it wasn't. With its 2MHz processor, 8 screen colours, and 32KB of RAM, it was the first choice for British schools, not homes. But look closer. Despite its modest specifications, it had a decent catalogue, almost all of it original, and was an incubator of industry talent. Martin Edmondson, Jeff Crammond, David Braben, and Chris Roberts all did their earliest work on this computer. But the Beeb's gaming high point came courtesy of none of these luminaries. Never released outside Europe, Peter Irvin and Jeremy Smith's 1988 masterpiece Exile was a Metroidvania 6 years before Super Metroid, with features that even that game wouldn't match. Exile is a case study in outsmarting hardware constraints, in doing a lot in a tiny space, in making every byte count. Both programmers had a background in mathematics, and had previously written games featuring physics-based gameplay. Starship Command from Irvin, and from Smith, the punishing classic Thrust. Pooling their efforts, they were able to pull off something truly ambitious. In Exile, the player controls Mike Finn, sent to a remote planet to investigate the disappearance of a prior expedition. Finding your spaceship disabled by a mysterious antagonist, you must explore, locate any survivors, and find a way off the planet. A massive contiguous scrolling system of caverns that could be explored relatively freely, full of obstacles that could be circumvented in any way the game's systems allowed. This was true emergent gameplay, with a list of features that wouldn't look out of place today. Visually, the game boasted impressive effects, particle systems and individually simulated projectiles that gave much more powerful machines a run for their money. Okay, the scrolling was a bit jerky, but remember, this game is running on hardware from 1981. Integral to the game were physical simulations. Every object had mass and buoyancy and exerted friction, and air currents in the caverns created environmental complications. Most impressively, your character's movement by jetpack featured realistic momentum. You pushed keys corresponding not to the direction you wanted to move, but to the force you wanted to apply, mentally compensating for gravity and wind. This method of control required some practice, and formed a large part of the game's appeal. Creature AI was another important component. The caves were full of alien life, not all of it hostile. Birds would defend their nests. They couldn't hurt you, but they could get in your way, and their nudges could knock you off course. Imps would throw things at you, but give them gifts and they might hand you something useful in return. Wasp nests could pose a threat, but with one of those irritating birds in tow, you have an unlikely ally. The game was huge, and the possible solutions elaborate, so much so that few people have ever completed it unassisted. There was no published walkthrough for over 2 years, and when a magazine finally printed one, written in a compact shorthand, it filled 6 pages. There were ports of Exile to the Commodore 64 and 16-bit systems that weren't nearly as constrained by hardware, but the BBC Micro Original is a showcase of the art of doing a large amount with limited resources. The computation power of the Beeb wasn't the problem. Its processor was as fast or faster than most of its peers. But on an expanded system, memory was very tight, and dynamic loading of data was impossible. The problem facing Irvin and Smith was how they would fit their entire game into the machine's main memory. There was little room for size or complexity. The standard BBC Micro, the Model B, had 32KB of RAM, but it wasn't all accessible to programs. The RAM was shared with the video, so you'd always lose some off the top. How much depended on the display mode you chose to use. If, like the creators of Exile, you wanted to use the full colour palette, all 8 of them, 20K of RAM would be occupied by video, leaving only 12 for the program and all of its data. By way of comparison, in the same year Castlevania 2 came out on the NES, and the ROM was over 20 times that size. So how do you fit a game this ambitious into 12KB? How do you take a machine to its absolute limit? By using every possible space-saving trick. There was no room to explain the story, or anything the player encountered in the world, so the game came with a 20,000-word novella in the box, providing a detailed backstory and establishing some of the geography, creatures and items players could use to orient themselves in the early game. There was no text in the game, not even a HUD. Information that might normally be displayed on screen, like weapon energy levels, was revealed through sound, while the score could be seen only through a separate loader, called the supervisor. The code was extremely compact and sophisticated. Even those experienced in 6502 disassembly have been unable to determine exactly what parts of it are doing. Some of it is self-modifying, instructions that rewrite other instructions mid-execution. Sprites, which can take up a lot of memory, were stored in a dense 4-colour tile map. Every image in the game is in this tiny graphic, with the full range of visuals achieved with extensive mirroring and palette shifting. The huge cavern system wasn't stored in memory. It probably wouldn't have fit even if it was the only thing in there. The chambers and tunnels were the result of an algorithm that always generated an identical result. Only a small handmade area at the start and end of the game, and the locations of important objects, had to be stored in memory. Save and load functions were omitted to save space. That's not to say that you had to complete the game in one sitting. Those functions existed in the separate supervisor program. Saving the game in Exile was a bizarre process. It involved hitting a special key combination that crashed the game, then soft resetting the machine, then reloading the supervisor and using the save game option. This was only possible because of a hack the creators developed that placed the save data in the one location in memory that could survive a reboot. Even with these optimizations, there was still no way to fit this game into 12 kilobytes. But remember that 20k of video memory they lost? By making the playfield smaller and packing data into the rest of that space, they reclaimed some of it, manipulating the display controller chip to black out those parts of the screen. If you could see it, the rest of the screen would be filled with visual noise, the code and data of the game itself. This hack gave them back just enough memory to accommodate the entire game. They used almost every byte of available memory. It's a stunning piece of optimization. In 2002, Exile was awarded one of the scarcest honours in game journalism, the prestigious Edge magazine 10 out of 10. In a special retrospective issue that featured reviews of games released before Edge's launch in 1993, it was one of only 2 to receive a perfect score. Smith and Irvine never made a follow-up to Exile. Whether or not the possibility was ever on the table, the tragic death of Jeremy Smith in 1992 rendered any such project moot. So Exile, largely unknown outside Europe, is a game without much of a legacy. It didn't exert much influence on the genre that it anticipated. It's an island, a curiosity, a Metroidvania before that was a thing. But the spirit of making games in tight constraints is still in fine form. In the people who figure out ways to port new games to old hardware for fun, in the creative ingenuity of the Pico 8 community, and in the 64K, 8K, and 4K intro competitions held at demo parties. The legacy of Smith and Irvine, of Braben and Bell, of Paul Wokes and Mike Singleton and Binary Systems and the many other pioneers who, back in the 80s, found a way to fit a world into a few kilobytes, is still alive and well. Hi, Chris here. Maybe this has piqued your interest and you want to try Exile for yourself. Well, there are a bunch of options. The Commodore 64 port is probably the most faithful to the original, and can be played in the browser at the Internet Archive. A little harder to set up but worth the effort are the Atari ST and 2 separate Amiga ports, featuring title music by a 17-year-old Henry Jackman, who now scores blockbuster movies. All the ports have on-screen user interfaces and more naturalistic palettes than the original, so they're a little more accessible and a lot less garish. I'll put some links in the description. Thanks to my Patreon supporters for making this video possible, and thank you for watching. I'll see you again in the past.